and welcome to the Peas and Quiet podcast. On this podcast, we discuss all things gardening, including growing veggies and flowers and how to create your dream backyard alongside nature. My name is Robin. I'm an environmental scientist turned full-time flower farmer and gardener, and I'll be your host for this podcast. On today's episode, I am giving just a little bit of a winter garden update, chatting about what's growing well in the garden right now and some of the garden jobs that I'm working through. And I also chat a little bit about how to create some more fertilizers in your own garden to kind of complete the nutrient cycle to make sure you can grow nice and healthy plants, but also to make sure that you don't have to rely too much on bringing in fertilizers and bringing in inputs for your garden. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and communities. We pay our respects to elders past and present and thank them for protecting our lands, coastlines and ecosystems. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Welcome back to another episode of the Peas and Quiet podcast. It is just me again this week. I really enjoyed having Scott on last week to have just a bit of a chat about what we're doing in life. It was actually really nice for both of us to just sit down and have a chat about everything. We obviously have a lot of changes going on in our lives right now. So yeah, that was really nice to sit down and have a chat. So if you haven't already heard last week's episode, make sure to go and check that out. For today, I have a list of topics that I want to discuss on the podcast, but I also just want to sit down and do like a bit of a chill podcast about what's happening in our garden right now and just, do some garden updates. And I do this on my YouTube channel where you can kind of see a little bit more of a visual of what's happening. But I do know a lot of people actually like to do things while they consume content, and so that's why I thought I would just do a bit of a catch-up chat on the podcast, and that way if you have some gardening to do or just jobs around the house, or if you're driving to and from work and you just want to listen to someone talk about their garden, then this is the episode for you. I'm also going to probably chat a little bit about specifically some of the fertilizers that I'm making in the garden right now. So that'll kind of be at the end of the garden update. I'll do a bit of a chat on that. So honestly, the last week and a bit, the weather has not been favorable for gardening, really. It's been kind of really typical winter weather. We have been having some crazy winds, and that has caused a little bit of damage in the garden that I'll chat about. But yeah, it's just been a little bit challenging to find motivation to kind of go outside in the garden and get some jobs done. And I did that episode all about winter in the garden, which is very much like things that you can do to keep yourself busy and actually feel productive throughout winter. But again, there are those weeks where it's just really hard to do anything. And honestly, the last week and a bit, I've really been devouring content from the Northern Hemisphere in terms of just all people's harvests and things they're cooking with all of the beautiful produce that they're growing. And it's just getting me really excited for spring and summer, which is good for me because I need something to get me excited for warmer weather, because typically when the temperature warms up, I am not that excited. It's just like a love-hate relationship with summer, where I obviously really love the abundance and the harvests that you get in summertime. But then like all summer, I am wanting the temperature to go back down and I'm craving winter. So this year I'm trying to just really get myself excited. And I think a big part of that has been letting myself grow a lot more food instead of flowers. Granted, I'm still running the flower farm and I've got a few updates for that about what's happening. but I will always have that passion for growing food. I just think it's one of the most magical and wonderful things that you can do to grow fresh homegrown produce. And I'm this year very excited to just kind of get into preserving a little bit more, which I've kind of discussed here and there on the podcast. And I'm sure there'll be so many preserving chats and my learnings and probably failures of learning how to ferment and process different things that we're going to make with all of the produce that we grow this year. But I would also really like to have a guest on to kind of chat a little bit more about that. So if you do have anyone that you would like me to interview or chat to, not necessarily just about like processing and fermenting things, but any kinds of topics, then do let me know, because I do have a list. I just haven't got around to emailing people. So we'll get there eventually. But this podcast is very laid back, and I don't want to put a lot of pressure on myself as well, because I want this to be something that is sustainable for me to be able to create these podcast episodes throughout the rest of my pregnancy and then into motherhood. So yeah, bear with me as I get my life sorted, and also, keep on top of everything in the garden as well. So speaking of the garden, like I said before, we have been having really crazy weather and really bad wind gusts. Like I'm talking 70-kilometer-an-hour wind gusts for a few hours at a time here and there. And they're coming from the west, which is usually what happens, and sometimes southwest, sometimes northwest, but in that general direction. And this is usually what happens at this time of the year as we come into the later part of winter and early spring. We start to get all of the westerly winds that come in, and they can be quite destructive. So the other day I went for a walk down and noticed one of the trees were down, and it was a large acacia tree. So we dealt with that, and we've just been using hand tools to kind of cut that down a little bit. I've just been using like some tree loppers to break up all of the little smaller leaves and use that as mulch in the garden. And Scott has been using one of the saws that we have to deal with some of the larger bits, and hopefully we can make like some bean structures from them, or something that we can use in the garden. And it's been a really good way to just kind of connect a little bit more with what happened in terms of a tree coming down. I know a lot of people are really quick to seeing that as a really horrible problem that a tree's come down, and thankfully we didn't have any damage to any of the sheds or anything really, so that was fine. But I know a lot of people kind of see it as a really big problem, and they get out the chainsaws and all the electrical gear and petrol and diesel fueled garden equipment, and end up chopping it all up and then putting it in a burn pile and burning it. And I'm quite adamant at not doing that if I don't have to. I really do want to minimize as much carbon entering the atmosphere as I can, and burning trees that have fallen down is one way to add carbon back into the atmosphere. But it's also just a natural process that happens. Trees fall down and they end up breaking down. They create humus for the soil, feeds the plants, and it's an all-round good thing. So I'm trying to see it more of as a solution to some of the other problems that we've been having, which I chatted about in a previous video and podcast as well, just, about all the neighbors, and we're trying to just create like a privacy fence. So I'm using a lot of the leafy material from this tree to create a bottom layer of mulch, and we'll kind of create mini like hugelkultur mounds with the larger sticks to kind of create some more garden beds. Definitely the easy way would be to just put it all in a burn pile and burn it, and I'm just really sick of people doing that in my area that I live in. We often have people just do really big burn-offs, and it just really stinks. And it always is on like the days when I do my washing. People will just kind of have a big burn pile that they'll burn, and you can kind of tell that it's a lot of green material that people are burning by the smell and also the amount of smoke and the color of the smoke that comes up. And whilst I do, I obviously think responsible burning is vitally important for our landscape in Australia. Particularly doing like slow burns is very, very important. That's how a lot of our native trees and flowers and bushes it's how they're here and how they continue their life on this country. But I don't think sometimes in a suburban setting big burn-offs are necessary. And I think there are a lot more ways that we can start to use things that may seem like garden waste or garden rubbish and try and use them a little bit more or be a little bit more productive with that material. And so that's what I kind of strive to do with, a lot of the material that comes out of the garden. I think another good way if you have to remove things is to take them to like a green waste facility, because that way at least they can get composted there and turn into something that can be used for like parks around, or you can go get free mulch from these places. So there's ways around it. But for a small backyard, I don't think having regular burn-offs is necessary really. And I didn't really think that I would go down this rabbit hole to talk about this, but it is something that I think Scott is just sick of listening to me talk about this, but it's just something that I'm really passionate about is, finding other ways other than burning material to dispose of garden waste. Weird thing to be passionate about, but there's a lot of different ways you can reduce like how flammable something is. And like the biggest way is just creating hugelkultur mounds where you mound up either compost or soil on top of larger sticks and logs to kind of contain that moisture in the soil. As soon as that larger piece of wood starts to break down, it's not going to be very flammable. If it has that moisture content in it, it's going to start to act like a sponge and you're not going to have a problem. Where you do start to have problems is where you start to pile up on top of the ground a lot of dead sticks and woods, and Rocky has started crying, so that's going to be a little bit challenging to record this. He really wants to go for a walk, so we'll do that in a little bit. Anyway, you do start to have problems when you start to pile up woody debris and just leave it out in the open for drying out. And then obviously that's going to be, a very encouraging thing for bushfires. So there are lots of ways we can dispose garden waste, composting, hugelkultur mounds, using things as mulch, lots of different ways. I'll leave it there on that conversation because I could go on and on. But it is relevant to what we were doing because we were trying to figure out like how are we going to deal with this tree that has fallen down in a way that is sustainable and that we can actually feed our soil and not have it as a burden, rather see it as a benefit and try and follow nature's principles to be able to deal with this tree, I suppose. Other than that, I really haven't been doing too much else. I've been planting a little bit of the flower farm. I just planted another half a bed of stock flower. Still a good time to get stock in the ground. It's one of my favorite flowers. I love the smell, I love the colors, and I love how it looks. So I'm very excited to get some flowers from that. It is a little bit disheartening to just see the flowers not really growing at all. And a part of me gets a bit worried to think like, there's not enough nutrients in my soil, but it really just is still a little bit too cold for plants to be really, really growing a lot and growing quickly. So if you're like me and you're feeling a bit disheartened, don't worry. Even if you just don't look at plants for just a few days, they will have a little bit of growth. For me, I'm just really impatient and I go down every day looking, and obviously it's a little hard to see a difference, but I do know when I film garden tours each month that they do definitely change, so I just need to be a little bit more patient. Another very exciting thing that has happened is actually all of my potatoes have sprouted. I might have already mentioned this, but I have noticed a significant increase in the growth of the potatoes. So I am very, very excited to be able to, I'll probably be hilling them up when maybe they get to about 10-15 centimeters or so. I'll hill them up or top up the pots if they're growing in the pots or the ground to make sure that I can have extra potatoes grow. And it really won't be that long, just like a few months till we can have fresh, beautiful, homegrown potatoes again. I'm going to have like the best celebration when I can have my potatoes because, homegrown potatoes are something else. And I'm so excited for potatoes. I know a lot of other people share my enthusiasm for this, so I know I'm not the only one. But that's something that has been bringing me a lot of joy in the garden right now, is seeing all of those beautiful potatoes sprout. And I've also been really noticing an increase in growth with a lot of the brassicas, particularly the ones that I have been feeding with my worm tea that I make from all of the worm farms. I have been doing foliar feeds of the brassicas each week. I've been feeding them and they've really responded really well. It's probably a combination between that and also the weather warming up, but I've noticed that they've been really enjoying all of the extra food that they've been getting. Brassicas, while they're young and while they're growing and putting on all of their leafy growth, they need quite a lot of nitrogen. So heavily feeding your brassicas is definitely advised after they kind of get their roots established. And then you could pull back a little bit on the nitrogen as you start to see like the broccoli heads forming or, the cabbage forming a little bit more. Because if you do kind of keep that nitrogen growth up, you can sometimes encourage too much growth and too much fast growth, which could put the plant into thinking that it actually wants to go to seed as well. So for now, I'm just keeping up really good nitrogen. And the plants are responding well. And as they grow and they start to get all of their broccoli heads and cabbage heads, I'll back a bit off on the nitrogen and maybe do more like fortnightly feeds instead. This is also the exact same for onions. So I've also been making sure to fertilize them. Pretty much like the bigger and the more strong and healthy the greens of your onions and leeks are going to be, the larger your onion is going to be and the larger your leeks will end up being. So heavily feeding these as they are putting on green growth with lots of nitrogen. I'm always so surprised at how much nitrogen alliums, which is all of your onion family, how much they actually need, but they are very heavy feeders. So making sure that you give them regular foliar feeds with either worm tea or whatever fertilizer you use, and or making sure that you have really well rotted animal manure in your soil or homemade compost, or just something to make sure that you can feed your onions and leeks and everything like that is really important to make sure that you have good growth with those plants. I suppose the last garden update that's happening in my garden at the moment is all of my anemones have started blooming. So I'm actually about to go I have been picking a few here and there, but I want to just go and deadhead a lot of them and make sure that they kind of keep continuing their growth. Usually the first flush of anemones, the stems are quite short, so I'm just probably going to make myself another little bouquet. I've just been making little bouquets here and there for me to enjoy. The flower farmer always gets the first bouquet, so I'm happy to enjoy the flowers while I can. And then kind of like my protocol for anemones is after I do the first trim of them, I'll cut back all of the flowers that are flowering, and then I'll also give them a feed to make sure that they put on extra growth, that they can focus on growing the plants rather than just sending up flowers. And gradually over time, those stems will get longer and stronger, and those are the ones that I'll then be able to use in bouquets to sell at my local garden centre and farm shop as well. So that's basically all of the garden updates. I have started a few more seeds, like some lettuce, shallots. All of my straw flowers have popped up now, so I'll be transplanting them in a few weeks and planting them out. And I've still got to plant out a lot of statice and feverfew. So those are kind of my jobs that I'm working on at the moment. Scott and I are very excited and very keen to get growing all of our warmer season plants and seeds. But I'm just going to hold off for another few weeks because it is still very chilly and we don't have an indoor lighting setup or heat mats or anything like that to be able to germinate seeds inside. So I just want to wait a little bit longer for those, and then we'll get all of our tomatoes and chilies and all of that started. And then it's kind of go time after that, and we'll be very busy. But coming back to the topic of fertilizers and just keeping nutrients in the garden and kind of just making my own little nutrient cycle in my garden, I suppose. I wanted to do just like a little chat on this. I'm hoping this podcast isn't going to be too long today, just because I just wanted to do a bit of a shorter sit down one. But I do want to talk about this a little bit because I think it's really important for us as gardeners to be able to think of ways that we can complete a nutrient cycle in our garden. And this is something that happens in nature and is an ecosystem service, really, where nutrient cycling is always happening in nature to continue to feed all of the different types of ecosystems that require different nutrients. You can think of things like a mangrove ecosystem needs a lot of different nutrients than like a rainforest, but all of those nutrients are constantly cycling through the soil, through the air, through the clouds, through all of the weather systems, and moving across the world to be able to feed the plants and therefore keep that ecosystem going. And it's kind of something we can also comprehend in the garden to understand how we can keep nutrients and cycle that through in our own gardens rather than relying on bringing in a lot of nutrients. There are a lot of ways that we can make our own and make our own fertilizers to continue to feed our plants. Fertilizers are probably I think they're just one of the most wasteful things that we can spend our money on, in terms of inorganic fertilizers is what I'm more referring to. And unfortunately, a lot of our agriculture systems or conventional agriculture systems really do rely on chemical fertilizers to be able to feed plants now. And that's just because there isn't enough nutrients left in the soils because there isn't that constant natural nutrient cycling that happens where we're taking a lot more than nature can actually create for us. So one of the biggest ways that you can create your own fertilizers in the garden is by making different types of fermented plant teas. And this is something I know I've touched on this a little bit before, but I wanted to just share what I am working on in the garden right now and what I'm creating. I am kind of creating two different types of fermented teas. The first one is comfrey tea, and I'm also just making some weed teas from all of the different weeds that I pull in the garden to ferment them in water and then be able to use that liquid and dilute it and use as a foliar feed for the plants. So I'm sure you've heard about comfrey before. It's definitely one of my favorite permaculture plants to use, and I think every garden could benefit with having a few comfrey plants. I started out with one basically, and now I have probably dozens of comfrey plants. They divide so easily. You can also propagate them from seed or by cuttings of the roots, and they're just a great plant. They're a dynamic bioaccumulator, really. Can't remember the exact term, but it's something like that. Basically what it does is it draws up certain nutrients from below the soil, and goes a little bit deeper than some other plants because it has a really large complex taproot system which can then bring up that nutrients into the leaves, which can then be deposited onto the ground, and therefore those nutrients that it brings up through the roots are a little bit more available to other plants that don't have a very complex root system and that kind of rely more on surface feeding. So it's a great plant to have around fruit trees. Quite a lot of fruit trees actually don't have complex taproot systems compared to a lot of plants like Australian natives, for example, like eucalypts and gum trees. They have a very strong taproot system that grows really deep into the soil to be able to draw up moisture and to find water. A lot of fruit trees are actually surface feeders. So examples like citrus trees, they will actually feed a lot from what is in the upper layers of the soil because they have very fine roots that will kind of expand and grow around the tree to be able to uptake as much nutrients as they can. They will still have a large root system that goes deep below, but they do rely heavily on what's on the surface. So that's why planting things like comfrey can be really beneficial, because that will draw up the nutrients from deeper beneath the surface of the soil, bring them up. The leaves can be deposited around fruit trees, which will then feed them. It's an absolutely fantastic plant, and just also has a lot of micronutrients and macronutrients that plants really need to survive. It's got a really great NPK ratio. It's particularly high in potassium as well. So is going to be, if your soils might be low in potassium, again, really great plant to have. And you can actually harvest it at the stage that will benefit whatever problem you have the most. So the plant is actually going to be a little bit higher in things like potassium when the plant is flowering versus when it just has greenery and vegetation. Then you're going to get a little bit more in nitrogen. So depending on what you need and what you desire for your plants, you can kind of cut it back at different times. It's also such a great plant for pollinators, and I know like blue-banded bees, the native bees, they absolutely love these, and they're one of my favorite things to see in the garden. I used to see them all the time in Brisbane around the comfrey, and it was just so lovely to see. But what I've been doing with these is chopping them back, basically like just getting some shears and chopping them to the base of the plant. They will resprout over time. They really don't mind a good harsh cutback. And just putting this in a bucket and adding some water. I like to use rainwater that I collect just off one of our sheds into buckets. And that's just because I know it's going to have a good pH and not have any extra additives into it. And then I let the fermentation process happen, which is basically where you're going to create a liquid, and that liquid is then going to have all of those macronutrients and nutrients that plants need in a water-soluble form. So this means that the plants will be able to uptake those nutrients really easily. They can either uptake them through their roots, but another way is that plants can uptake nutrients is through their leaves and through the pores on a leaf. So there's different types of fertilizers. You can get water soluble or insoluble fertilizers. So water soluble fertilizers are things like if you're making like a fermented tea with comfrey or weeds, or like seaweed concentrate that you're then diluting into water. Insoluble fertilizers are things like bone meal and fish meal that actually they need a bit of interaction with microbes to be able to activate and then for plants to be able to uptake that nutrients. So there's so many different ways that plants can uptake nutrients, which I think is really interesting. And one of the fastest ways is actually through foliar feeding your plants. So creating some kind of liquid that then can be uptaken by the plants through their leaves. So to make the fertilizer, it's very simple. I've basically just already talked you through it. I just fill up the bucket with water. I weight it down with I just have terracotta like saucers around that you put under pots. I just place that over the comfrey leaves so that all of the comfrey leaves are below the water level, in the bucket. And this is kind of like the same process as if you're making sauerkraut or ferments at home, where you need all of the material to be below the liquid level to make sure that mold isn't going to develop. Although it's really not much of a big deal if you do have mold develop with these kinds of fertilizers, because you're not really ingesting it and the plants won't mind. So yeah, don't worry too much if you do get a bit of mold. I have had a bit of growth of that. And to deal with that, you can just take the lid off. I like to keep the lid on while I'm letting the fermentation process happen, just because I don't want extra rainwater to enter and then dilute it even more. But if you are finding you're getting a mold problem, you can just stir it a little bit more, or just bring it under cover and just add a little bit more air to that bucket. So I leave it to brew and to ferment for quite a while. I left this one for about 6 weeks or so now, and it's very, very stinky. And honestly, just be prepared. Really be prepared at how smelly this can be. The smell is normal, and it's very gag inducing. So just be aware of this before you go into it. Have it just a little bit further away from where you have your morning cup of tea in the garden. And you basically just let it sit until it dissolves. And this will happen a lot quicker in warmer temperatures. So 6 weeks is probably too long for how I'll do this in summer. I'll probably just take maybe 10 to 12 days if it's really, really warm. But it's been quite cold, and we've had a few frosts here and there, so the process is a little bit slower. But once you're done, you can just give it a strain and just compost all of the leftover comfrey leaves, or you can just dig them in a hole around some fruit trees, and then you've got some free fertilizer. And this is great to dilute. I use 1 part fertilizer to about 10 parts water, and then I will just mix this up in a watering can and then water onto all of my veggie and flower seedlings. The smell definitely reduces over time, and you can use it when it's still really stinky if you want, or you can just wait and the smell will really be lowered over time, which is what I'm doing. And I probably wouldn't recommend adding this onto your lettuce if you're about to harvest it that day. Do it a few days before you do your harvest if you're close to harvesting. But for adding to your seedlings and just giving them an extra feed, it's a really, really great time as all of these plants and brassicas and onions are growing at the moment. I'm particularly excited to use this on tomatoes when we plant these in the ground, because it can just really help with the fruit setting, and potassium is one of the main nutrients that you need for flowers. So as the plant is starting to flower, it's a great time to add comfrey tea liquid fertilizer onto your plants. So that's what I'll be doing as we come into the warmer months. And I'll also be making some weed teas as well. So it's the exact same process. It's going to be pretty stinky again. But you can use basically any weed that you like. That I probably would steer clear of things like weeds of national significance unless you are going to be fermenting this for an extended period of time and you're doubly sure that the plant isn't going to reroot itself, or that the seeds, you dispose of them. Just being mindful and using common sense with whatever weeds are in your area. But for things like dandelions, they're a perfect addition to a weed tea, particularly the root, which also kind of acts like comfrey as well and brings up different nutrients from the soil. Dandelions are definitely a great weed to make your own fertilizer. Also nettle, if you have that in your area, is a very popular one. And you can really use anything. Like I have been making fertilizer just out of the grass that I have. And you can use grasses like kikuyu that can be such a pain, but for some of these you might want to wait a little bit longer before you do actually apply these teas to your garden, just to make sure that that vegetation and those grasses have really broken down, it can take a while for all of those runner grasses to break down, but they will over time. They'll just disintegrate in the water, release all of their nutrients that they've accumulated, and then you can be able to use that in your garden on something a little bit more productive than having just grass go through your veggie garden. And then the last thing, I've already spoken about this, but the last way I am feeding my plants is just through worm tea. And this is the easiest fertilizer for me to make. I have a few worm farms that we don't add kitty litter into, or things that come out of the kitty litter. We have designated ones for those, which I don't use anywhere near the veggie gardens. I'm very responsible with how I use all of the cat waste byproducts in the garden. It's just something that, we do still have to deal with. But I use all of the ones that don't have that in it to make all of my fertilizer for the veggie garden. And this is really easy to obtain because pretty much whenever I need some, I can just pour some water into the worm bin if it hasn't already been really moist from food scraps and garden waste that we add to them. And then that'll drip out through the tap, and then I can use that diluted in water to also feed the plants. And ones that I haven't made yet, but I'll probably be making some of my own seaweed concentrate. I can get some seaweed from around some of the beaches that we live near. Obviously making sure to responsibly take that, and I'll follow all of the guidelines that we have, but in some of our areas you are permitted to take a few bags of seaweed and use that in your garden. So that's what I'm going to do, make my own seaweed concentrate, which is obviously great for the garden. And if I did have animals like chickens or anything else, you can also use animal manure to create fertilizers and to create foliar feeds for your plants. Some of these you might need to have them sit for a bit. And I know a lot of people use they basically make a really big tea bag and just add that into a bucket of water. And some people get really fancy and start to aerate it, and that's all well and good if you really want to speed that process up. I've never personally done that and always had really great success with just chucking things in a bucket and letting it naturally ferment. So if you have tried, really making that aerated compost tea, then let me know how it's worked for you. I prefer to use a lot of my compost just directly onto the garden because I want all of those microbes and life to basically just be added into my existing soil. But you can also make liquid fertilizers from that as well. And there's so many other things you can make liquid fertilizers from, all of your kitchen scraps, coffee grounds, leftover things from if you're boiling pasta or rice or veggies. You can use that as well. It's just a lot less strong and nutrient rich. By all means, use it on your garden, but you'll definitely find a lot more benefits from making things like weed tea and comfrey tea that your plants can benefit from. So that's kind of it for a little bit of a garden catch up, garden update, and what I'm working on. I am just really interested in trying to create as much fertilizer as I can this year, mainly because I really want to save a bit more money and be a bit more budget friendly to myself in the garden, and also just work a little bit at a smaller scale. I find working at smaller scales and actually just working with what you have, rather than me always thinking about how can I extend the flower farm, how can I grow more flowers to earn more money for the business. This year I just really want to slow down a little bit and just potter around and work on little projects like making my own fertilizer or tending to my worm farms or tending to a tomato plant or whatever I'm doing, just to really make sure I can grow the best quality food that I can to, for both my health, baby's health, Scott's health, everyone who visits. I just really want to grow as much beautiful food as we can to enjoy while we live here before we embark on a different journey and start growing on a different property. I'm really excited to make the veggie garden the best it can, and also just, still enjoy the flowers just at a bit more of a manageable pace for keeping the business going, but also keeping my sanity with, having a newborn, I suppose. So I think I might wrap this episode up here. I really hope you enjoyed listening, and I would love to know if you can leave a comment on YouTube or send me a message or share the podcast on Instagram about what you're working on in your garden at the moment. I'd love to see what you're working on, what you're planting, what you're harvesting and growing. It is such a wonderful thing that we can have so many people sharing what's happening in their gardens to kind of fuel that motivation and inspiration that we really need throughout the cooler months. So I'm definitely leaning towards a lot of consuming that kind of content right now to get me excited and to fuel that passion to really create a beautiful and abundant garden this year. So I hope you're all staying nice and warm and cozy if you're in a colder climate right now, or if you're in a warm climate, I hope that summer is treating you well and isn't too harsh, but also allowing you to have a beautiful harvest. I will be back next week with another episode. Thank you so much for being here today. If you wouldn't mind, I would love if you could give this podcast a rating. It really does help to push the podcast out a little bit more to people so we can start to have more conversations about gardening, and also helps me to just know what episodes you like best. But thanks so much. I will be back next week. I hope you're all having a lovely day wherever you are in the world. And until my next one, happy gardening, everyone. Bye.